She went off to go run for office, and then her successor, Janet DeFiore, said, of course we'll test the DNA. The DNA was tested, and it immediately pointed to another person.
Season 4 of Wrongful Conviction, Episode 8, Jeffrey Deskovic.
And then the trial comes. And just before the trial, the results of the DNA test comes back from the FBI laboratory, which shows that the semen found in the victim didn't match me.
Right, because remember, she was raped, right?
She was raped, yes. And by the way, the lieutenant who oversaw everything, in the letter that he penned to the FBI asking them to expedite the testing, he wrote in the letter that the DNA testing would either show my guilt or it would exonerate me. But when it came back and it didn't match me, my lawyer did try to get the indictment dismissed against me based on that, but the judge denied that motion.
That alone seems so just incomprehensible to me. I mean, the judge is impartial, right? We know the prosecutor has an agenda, but the judge is impartial. Yeah, I don't know. I don't understand. I mean, I know that back then DNA wasn't...
It wasn't as well known, but to be clear, I mean, DNA started being used in the court system as early as 1987, and we're on trial now in 1990, so it's been around for 3 years. So while not in currency like now, it is not exactly totally unknown.
Right, and it's perfect. I mean...
Right. It's the gold standard.
Yeah. So your DNA doesn't match. This is an inconvenient truth for the authorities, and the judge allows this circus to go on. Meanwhile, let's spend a moment talking about the actual perpetrator.
Yes.
Because every time, and I sound like a broken record when I say this, but every time that somebody like you gets convicted wrongfully, the actual perpetrator, they stop looking for him, right? The case is closed. And in this case, the consequences were very real.
Yes, school teacher Patricia Morrison, who also had a couple of kids. She was from Peekskill, and she was killed by the same perpetrator, Stephen Cunningham. She was killed 3.5 years later as a result of Cunningham being left free on the street while I was doing time for his crime. Yeah.
Now, you say the real perpetrator. How do we know that?
Well, great. That's a great question. I'm so glad you asked. Because the DNA matched him. Because he got caught for the second murder, Patricia Morrison, which resulted in his being incarcerated and having to give up a DNA sample, which was put into the data bank. And so when I eventually got the further testing with the Innocence Project's help, it matched him. And then he subsequently confessed, and he pled guilty in court.
When did this happen?
That happened 12.5 years after he killed a second victim.
Wow. So Patricia Morrison,
yes,
today would be probably
alive,
sitting around with her grandchildren, probably be a retired school teacher by now, having a nice life. Her children would have grown up as they deserve to, as everyone deserves to with their mother. The rest of her family wouldn't have gone through this horrendous loss. None of it had to happen, except for the fact that they went on this crazy witch hunt to convict you, Jeffrey Deskovic, of a crime that they knew you didn't commit.
So he was exonerated, got millions of dollars from Westchester County and Putnam County, which the taxpayers should be livid about, that, this case was allowed to happen. And same thing in Damien's case. The 7 or 8 years was spent with a guy on death row. 7 or 8 years was spent fighting DNA testing because of the finality of judgment concept in our legal system, which is absurd.
Years later, they do DNA testing, find out that the DNA does not match me or the other two guys they had convicted. To this day, they still have not run that DNA through CODIS to see who it matches. They refuse to do that.
Yeah, which is so strange because in a case like this, especially in a small community, the people who are doing the investigating live in that community by definition. When you have somebody out there who's capable of this sort of pure evil, you would think if for no other reason than purely selfish reasons, you would want to get that person off the street.
Yep.
But that's not what happened, and it happens too frequently that these various factors combine to result in a tragic outcome.
And what people don't realize also, just most people's knowledge of the legal system comes from watching TV. And it fosters this idea that these people, these judges, these prosecutors, these attorney generals, that they have these positions because they're somehow moral people. They're good people who are looking out for society. In actual fact, these are politicians, just like senators, just like congressmen. Their number one priority is winning that next election. So they're going to do...
Or that next case.
Exactly. Whatever the community is pressuring them to do, that's the way they're going to lean because they want to win the next election.
The legal system should be about finding the truth. And if there's reason to believe that somebody has a wrongful conviction claim, especially with the advent of DNA technology, which, that was a new thing. The fact that a prosecutor can fight DNA testing like they did in Damien's case for 8 or 9 years, like they did in Jeffrey Deskovic's case, which resulted in the death of another innocent human being, it's just outrageous.
And that's true, too, in the Central Park 5 case, where Linda Fairstein prosecuted those 5 kids, even though she knew she had the evidence. She knew they didn't do it. And they had every reason to suspect that Matthias Reyes was the actual killer.
Yep.
And then he went out and raped 3 other women and killed one of them in front of her kids. Yep. I mean, it's like, I'm getting the chills just thinking about it. Like, that is so bad. And we should all want that to end, right?
Yeah. I'm telling you, if some tougher laws were passed about prosecutors being held accountable for their actions, I think a lot of this shit would end. It's about winning at all costs. It's not about the search for the truth. And again, I'm friends with a prosecutor. I know many good prosecutors. There's good guys out there, so I'm not saying every prosecutor is like that, but the system is human. It's the reason you cannot have a death penalty because the system is human, and it's so easy. We see with Damien how an innocent person can be killed. And so I've spent a lot of times talking to the mothers of victims of violent crime, and they want vengeance. And I understand that desire to have vengeance. And I don't want to look a mother in the eye and say to her, you don't morally have the right to want the death of the killer of your child. But we don't even have to get to that moral place, because the death of one innocent person on death row, to me, means you can't have a death penalty because the system is fallible. It's run by human beings, some of whom want to win at all costs.
No, that's the argument I have with anybody who's pro-death penalty. I always say, okay, what percentage of innocent people are you okay with executing?
Exactly.
Is it 5%, 10%? I mean, we know that of the people that have been exonerated from death row, there's proof that 4% of people that were on death row are innocent. But we don't know how many others were executed that were innocent as well, because most of those cases just literally die when that death takes place.
Right.
No one goes and investigates those cases. I want to say, too, there was one period of time where Harry Connick Sr. was the DA in New Orleans, and he put 8 people on death row, and 6 of them were exonerated. I don't know whether the other 2 were innocent or guilty or what became of them, but that was a pretty scary time right there. And there was that amazing 60 Minutes piece where another prosecutor from New Orleans actually came forward and with tears and said that, he feels terrible to this day about a guy that he put on death row that he knew was innocent, and he withheld the evidence, and he talks about his sort of perverse motives, and it's just not a thing. Like, the death penalty is not a thing. And just a slight divergence, when you said earlier that the typical exoneree gets $1 million a year, the typical exoneree actually gets nothing, right? I mean, some of them get paid, but even then it varies wildly from whether they get paid thousands of dollars or tens of thousands, or in the rare case like Jeffrey Deskovic, they actually did manage to get millions of dollars, but those are rare. You have to prove civil rights violations. And I'll never forget, there was a guy who I actually was friendly with. He's gone now, but he was sentenced to death in Louisiana and came within days of being executed before somebody found with a microscope and some brilliant scientific research was able to prove with DNA that he was innocent. And he was exonerated and freed, and he was awarded $14.5 million, and the state of Louisiana appealed it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court overturned the award 5-4. He had proven that they had willfully prosecuted him while knowing that he was innocent, and the Supreme Court made some bizarre ruling that it wasn't the responsibility of the prosecutors to train the younger prosecutors, that they had to turn over exculpatory evidence, and that he had to prove a pattern of misconduct. It was just totally nuts. Mm-hmm. And he wrote an op-ed in the New York Times where he said, I don't understand why the prosecutor who tried to kill me
Well, I think they're trying to wear you down.
Why?
So you just accept your death so that you don't make a scene for the witnesses who are experiencing it.
Is that what it is? I don't know.
No one's told me that, but I just feel like they're just trying to wear you down so you don't fight back. And Glossop told me himself, he was so tired that, he was accepting of his fate, even though he knew it was wrong, and if it wasn't for the wrong drug, he'd be gone.
It's so incredibly troubling because, why? Just why? You got the guy you wanted. You got the actual killer. You guys did your job, right? It's done. What do you need the extra body for? And there's so many Richard Glossops out there.
And the other weird and hard dynamic is that the family of the victim in that case believes that Glossop is guilty. And for years, the families of the West Memphis Three... the families of the victims, the parents of Michael Moore, Christopher Byers, and Stevie Branch, thought we were horrible people, just Hollywood elites. And so funny when I'm called a Hollywood elite. I live an hour north of Manhattan in I'm about as far away from Hollywood as possible. But, that somehow Hollywood elites conspired to get these devil worshippers out of prison. For years, they hated us, they called us names. And that's painful because you don't want to, as makers of these things, you want to shine a light on the truth, but you don't want to cause the families pain. And that's the disservice that these police officials and prosecutors who maintain this facade of righteousness, that's the damage they inflict on the family members because, A, there's no justice because the real killers are running free. And secondly, the healing process, we're both parents and I can't imagine, anything worse than losing a child, and there's no closure for losing a child, but there certainly can be finality to the experience. And your healing process is predicated on knowing justice has been served. And so we came along and upset the apple cart by coming out with a film that's saying, hey, everything the police and prosecution and all your 10,000 meetings with these people is wrong. And you're putting these families through a double tragedy. And for years, they hated our guts. And two of the three families came to accept our point of view by the end of the second Paradise Lost. But even by the time of the third Paradise Lost, which came out in 2011 and coincided with their release, one of the families, the movie was nominated for an Academy Award and some other prizes. And I mention that only because these families took the time to write to the Academy and to the Directors Guild and every place that had nominated us for a prize to say that these films are works of fiction, that we manipulated them, we lied to them, that the West Memphis Three are guilty. And I have, even though they hate us, I have endless reservoirs of sympathy for them because, again, going through this experience is every parent's worst nightmare, and then to be victimized by the system again because the police and the prosecution have lied to them. That's the other part that people don't really think about is what happens to the victims when the truth is just not the truth.
Who do you think killed those kids?
I don't want to do to somebody else what I think was done to Damien. I'd rather.
Enough.
What I do know is that the case needs to be reopened, that we all know that no sane prosecutor would knowingly let convicted